When looking at human-computer interaction, we're really looking at the tasks that users perform. We look at the tasks that they're performing now, and we try to restructure those tasks to be more efficient using new interfaces. In all of this, the task is at the heart of the exercise. What task are they performing? So today, we're going to talk about two methods for formally articulating the tasks that people are completing. First, we'll discuss human information processor models, especially the Gomes model, which focuses on the input to the user and the output from the user. Note, this is similar to the processor model of the user that we discuss elsewhere. Second, we'll discuss cognitive task analysis, a way of trying to get inside the user's head instead of focusing just on the input and the output. Note that that's similar to the predictor model of the user that we also discuss elsewhere. The Gomes model is a human information processor model, so it builds off the processor model of the human's role in a system. The Gomes model gets its name from the four sets of information it proposes gathering about a task. G stands for the user's goals in the system. O stands for the operators the user can perform in the system. M stands for the methods that the user can use to achieve those goals. And S stands for the selection rules that the user uses to choose among different competing methods. So the Gomes model proposes that every human interacting with the system has a set of goals that they want to accomplish. They have a set of methods that they can choose from to accomplish those goals. Each of those methods is comprised of a series of operators that carries out that method, and they have some selection rules that help them decide what method to use and when. The Gomes model is often visualized like this. The user starts with some initial situation, and they have a goal in mind that they want to accomplish. So they apply their selection rules to choose between different competing methods for accomplishing that goal. Once they've chosen a method, they execute that series of operators that makes that goal a reality. We can take the Gomes model and apply it to a number of different domains. So let's take the example of needing to communicate a message to a coworker. We have an initial situation, which is the need to transfer information to a coworker. That carries with it the implicit goal of the information having been transferred. We might have a number of different methods in mind for how we could do that. We could email them, we could walk over and talk to them in person, and we also have some selection rules that dictate how we choose amongst these methods. If what we need to transfer is very time sensitive, maybe we walk over and talk to them in person or call them on the phone. If the information we need to transfer is complex and detailed, maybe we write them an email. Or if it's more casual, maybe we chat with them or text them. No matter what method we choose, we then execute the series of operators that carries out that method, and the result is that our goal is accomplished. The information has been transmitted. Or we could also take the problem of navigation. Our initial situation is the need to get to our destination, which carries with it the implicit goal of having reached our destination. We might have different methods like take the scenic route, take the highway route, take the surface streets, and some selection rules that might say something like when it's rush hour on the highway, take surface streets, or if it's not time sensitive, take the scenic route. After choosing, we execute those operators and reach our goal. So in this way, Gomes models capture our goals, our different methods for carrying out those goals, and the individual operators that we use to execute those methods. Let's try this out. We're going to watch Morgan enter the house and undo her security system two different ways. After you watch the video, try to outline Morgan's goals, outcomes, methods, and selection rules. Now try to outline the goals, outcomes, methods, and selection rules for these two methods of disabling the security system. Here's one example of how you might design a Gomes model for disabling a security system. Our initial situation is that we're entering the home with the alarm set, and we have two methods for disabling the alarm. We can use the keypad, or we can use the keychain. Either way, our goal is that we've entered the home and re-enabled the alarm. Our selection rules might be something like if we have our hands full, we're going to use the keypad so we can get inside and put the stuff down, but if we don't have our hands full, we'll use the keychain. You might come up with other models for this that have either different methods, different operators, different selection rules. There are a lot of different ways we can capture a task with a Gomes model, depending on what you choose to focus on. There are strengths and weaknesses to the Gomes representation for tasks. One weakness is that it doesn't automatically address a lot of the complexity of these problems. For example, there are likely many different methods and submethods for addressing this goal. Before even getting to selection rules among what route to take, you might decide whether to take public transportation or whether to work from home that day. In parallel to that, even after deciding to drive, you might decide what car to take if your family has more than one car. The standard Gomes model leaves those kind of things out, although there are augmented versions that have been created to deal with this kind of complexity, like CMN Gomes or NGomesL. We'll talk about those a bit more later. A second weakness is that the Gomes model assumes the user already has these methods in mind. That means the user is already an expert in the area. Gomes models don't do a good job of accounting for novices or accounting for user errors. For example, if you were driving in an unfamiliar location, you don't even know what the methods are, let alone how to choose among them. The strength of Gomes models, on the other hand, is their ability to formalize user interaction into steps that we can use to actually make predictions. We can measure how long each of these operators takes, and so we can predict the overall efficiency of using a certain interface. For example, in this Gomes model, if we had included the operator to pull keys out of the user's pocket, we might quickly identify that the relative efficiency of these two methods is very much dependent on how long that step takes. The keychain method might be a lot faster if the user can get their keychain out pretty quickly. But for other users, the fact that they need to pull something out of their pocket while holding bags or holding a baby makes the keypad a more efficient option. By performing that kind of reasoning, we can focus on areas that either method and the interface as a whole can be improved. There are several varieties of Gomes models. These varieties share the commonality of goals, operators, methods, and selection criteria, but they differ in what additional elements they provide. Bonnie John and David Kiris cover 4 popular variations in a paper from 1996. The first is the vanilla Gomes we've talked about so far, and the other 3 are KLM Gomes, CMN Gomes, and N-Gomes L. Let's talk about what those acronyms actually mean. They start with the keystroke level model, which is the simplest technique. Here, the designer simply specifies the operators and execution times for an action and sums them to find the complexity of an interaction. This method proposed 6 different types of operators, although for modern interfaces we would need some new ones to cover touchscreens and other novel interfaces. A second variation is CMN Gomes. CMN Gomes is an extension of Gomes that features submethods and conditions in a strict goal hierarchy. For example, here we see a hierarchy of goals, as well as the ability to choose between multiple goals in different areas. Notice also the level of granularity behind these Gomes models. The goals go all the way down to little goals like moving text or deleting phrases. These are very, very low-level goals. Notice also the way this model is being used. The authors are using it to find the places where there's a lot of complexity that can be cut out. They do this by modeling how long each individual action takes, as well as looking at the number of interactions required and seeing if it can be cut down a bit. A third variation is called natural Gomes language. Natural Gomes language, or N-Gomes L, is a natural language form of Gomes that lends itself to human interpretation. In all these cases, the important point of emphasis is the way that these models allow us to focus in on places where we might be asking too much of the user. For example, in this model, the user was being asked to carry a lot of information in working memory. By making the assumptions and actions and operators this detailed, this model lets us target where working memory is being overly taxed in a way that we might miss when we're doing higher level designs. Here are 5 quick tips for developing Gomes models. Number 1, focus on small goals. We've used some pretty big examples, but Gomes was really designed to work in the context of very small goals, like navigating to the end of a document. You can abstract up from there, but start by identifying smaller moment-to-moment goals. Number 2, nest goals instead of operators. It's possible to nest goals. For example, in our Gomes model of navigation, we could develop it further and break the overall task of navigating down to smaller goals like changing lanes or plotting routes. Operators, however, are the smallest atoms of a Gomes model. They don't break down any further, and those must be the actual actions that are performed. Number 3, differentiate descriptive and prescriptive. Make sure to identify whether you're building a model of what people do or what you want them to do. You can build a Gomes model of what people should do with your interface, but you shouldn't trick yourself into thinking that's necessarily what they will do. Number 4, assign costs to operators. Gomes was designed to let us make predictions about how long certain methods will take. The only way we can do that is if we have some measurement of how long individual operations take. Usually this is time, but depending on the domain, we might be interested in phrasing the cost differently as well. Number 5, use Gomes to trim waste. One of the benefits of Gomes is it lets you visualize where an unnecessary number of operators are required to accomplish some task. That's bolstered by the costs we assign to those operators. So use Gomes to identify places where the number of operators required can be simplified by the interface. Gomes models are human information processor models. This method largely assumes the human is an input-output machine and it doesn't get too much into the internal reasoning of the human. Instead, it distills their reasoning into things that can be described explicitly, like goals and methods. Some would argue, myself included, that human reasoning is actually too nuanced and complex to be so simplified. They, or we, advocate other models that get more into what goes on inside the user's head. That's where cognitive task analysis comes in. Cognitive task analysis is another way of examining tasks, but it puts a much higher emphasis on things like memory, attention, and cognitive load. Thus, cognitive task analysis adopts more of the predictor view of the human's role in the system. This conflict between more processor-oriented and more predictor-oriented models of the user actually gets at the core of an old battle in psychology between behaviorism and cognitivism. Behaviorism emphasized things that could be observed. We can see what input a person is receiving, we can see the output they're producing, and that might be all we need to understand the design of things. Cognitivism, on the other hand, suggests we can and should get into the mind of what people are actually thinking and how systems like memory and learning and perception actually work. So take a moment and reflect on what you think about this. When designing interfaces, how much attention should you devote to observable goals, operators, and methods, and how much should you devote to understanding internal thought processes like cognition, learning, and memory? You can probably guess my bias on this issue, given that I've already badmouthed the processor model and I also teach cognitive systems. So I'm generally going to prefer methods that focus on cognition. I think it's important to note here, though, that both approaches have significant value. The Gomes model and its emphasis on identifying goals and operators is actually very useful in HCI because it forces us to very clearly and deliberately identify user goals and the sequence of actions that accomplish them. We can get so caught up in user experiences that we forget the user experience is born out of individual operators. So while I wouldn't advocate focusing solely on the user as some kind of input-output information processor, there's value in defining the user's operation as clearly and specifically as we define a computer's. Cognitive task analysis is not really a single method, but it's more of a type of method for approaching the evaluation of how people complete tasks. Performing a cognitive task analysis involves a number of different techniques and methods that we'll discuss more when we discuss the design lifecycle. For right now, though, we're interested in what kinds of information we're trying to gather, not how we're gathering it. Cognitive task analyses are especially concerned with understanding the underlying thought process in performing a task. Not just what we can see, but specifically what we can't see. There are a lot of different methods for performing cognitive task analyses, but most methods follow a particular common sequence. First, we want to collect some preliminary knowledge. While we as interface designers don't need to become experts in a field, we need a good bit of familiarity with it. So we might observe people performing the task, for example. In navigation, we might just watch someone driving and using a GPS. Our second step is to identify knowledge representations. In other words, what kinds of things does the user need to know to complete their task? Note that we're not yet concerned with the actual knowledge they have, only the types or structures of the knowledge that they have. For example, we want to know, does this task involve a series of steps to do in a certain order? Does it involve a collection of tasks to check off in any order? Does it involve a web of knowledge to memorize? For navigation, for example, we would identify that the structure of the knowledge is a sequence of actions in order, as well as some knowledge of things to monitor as we go. In the third stage, we actually want to populate those knowledge representations. This is the stage where we start to recognize what the user actually knows. With navigation, for example, they know to start the GPS, to enter an address, and to obey the turns while monitoring traffic and speed and things like that. During this stage, we identify all the specific actions they take, the knowledge they must have in mind to take those actions, the interruptions that can change their thought processes, the equipment involved, and the sensory experience of the user. We do this by applying focused knowledge elicitation methods. In other words, we get users to tell us what's going on in their heads or what's going on in their environment. Or sometimes we do things that help us understand parts of the task that the user isn't even themselves aware of. Then we analyze and verify the data we acquired. Part of that is just confirming with the people we observe that our understanding is correct. We might watch them do something and infer it's for one reason, when in reality it's for a very different reason. So we want to present to our users our results and make sure that they agree with our understanding of their task. Then we attempt to formalize it into structures that can be compared and summarized across multiple data gathering methods. And finally, we format our results for the intended application. We need to take those results and format them in a way that's useful for interface design. We want to develop models that show what the user was thinking, feeling, and remembering at any given time and make those relationships really explicit. The result might look something like this. Here we see a very high-level model of the process of driving to a destination. What's interesting to note is that these tasks in the middle are highly cognitive rather than observable. If I had no knowledge about driving and I sat in the passenger seat watching the driver, I might never know that they're monitoring their route progress or keeping an eye on their dashboard for how much fuel they have left. If you have kids, you may have experienced this personally, actually. To a kid sitting in the back seat, mommy or daddy are just sitting in the driver's seat just like they're sitting in the passenger seat. They don't have a full understanding of the fact that you have a much higher cognitive load and you're doing a lot more things while you're driving than they are. That's because what you're doing is not observable. It's all in your head. So to get at these things, I might have the user think out loud about what they're doing while they're doing it. I might have them tell me what they're thinking while they're driving the car. That would give me some insights into these cognitive elements of the task. Cognitive task analysis advocates building models of human reasoning and decision-making in complex tasks. However, a challenge presented here is that very often, large tasks are actually composed of many multiple smaller tasks. We can see this plainly present in our cognitive model of driving. These tasks are so high level that it's almost useful to describe driving in these terms. Each part could be broken down into various subtasks, like iteratively checking all the cars around you or periodically checking how long it is until the next turn needs to be made. What's more, these smaller tasks could then be used in different contexts. Route monitoring, for example, isn't only useful when driving a car. It might be useful while running or biking or while riding as a passenger. Traffic monitoring might be something that autonomous vehicles might do, not just a human user. So the analysis of a task in a particular context could be useful in designing interfaces for other contexts if we break the analysis down into subtasks. So let's take a simple example of this. Here is a somewhat simple model of the act of buying something online. Notice that a lot of the tasks involved here are general to anyone shopping on any website, and yet every website needs to provide all of these functions. As a side note, notice also the interesting analogy going on with the top two. Online, there is no cart or checkout station, but we borrowed those to help the user understand the shopping process online and how similar it is to shopping in a store. Now, anyway, if we treat this cognitive task analysis more hierarchically, we can start to see a well-defined subtask around this checkout process. Every online vendor I've ever encountered has these steps in its checkout process. Now, because this is so well-defined, we can actually leverage existing tools like existing payment widgets or something like PayPal. This hierarchical task analysis helps us understand what tools might already be available to accomplish certain portions of our task, or how we might design certain things to transfer between different tasks in different contexts. Hierarchical task analysis also lets the designers of the site abstract over this part of the process and focus more on what might make their particular site unique. This kind of task analysis is so common that you generally will find tasks and subtasks whenever you're looking at the results of a cognitive task analysis. So it's important to remember the strengths supplied by this hierarchy. Abstracting out unnecessary details for a certain level of abstraction, modularizing designs or principles so they can be transferred between different tasks or different contexts, and organizing the cognitive task analysis in a way that makes it easier to understand and reason over. Last, it's really important to note that the cognitive and hierarchical task analyses that we've shown here are extremely simplistic, mostly honestly because of the limited screen real estate. When you're creating real cognitive models, you'll likely have several levels of abstraction, several different states, and additional annotating information like what the user has to keep in mind or how they might be feeling at a certain stage in the analysis. We'll put some examples of some good, thorough models in the notes. Let's watch the videos of Morgan disabling her security system again. This time, though, let's try to approach this from a more cognitive task analysis perspective. We won't be able to do that fully because doing a full cognitive task analysis means interviewing, asking the user to think out loud, and more. But we can at least try out this approach. Remember, in doing a cognitive task analysis for a task like this, your goal is to build a model of the sequence of thoughts going on inside the user's head. Pay special attention to what she needs to remember at each step of the process. What we saw here was that to get inside and disable the alarm, there was a sequence of actions that had to be completed, but some of them could be completed in different orders. If she used the keypad, she had to first unlock the door and then open the door. Then she could either disable the alarm on the keypad or close the door. And after closing the door, she could relock the door, though she could also do that before disarming the alarm, so there's some choices there. With the keychain, the sequence of tasks related to the door remained the same, but she had the option of disarming the alarm before even entering. However, that required remembering to do so. When using the keypad, she didn't have to remember because the alarm beeps at her until she turns it off. but she has to remember the key code. Performing these cognitive task analyses gives us the information necessary to evaluate different approaches and look for areas of improvement. For example, if she can disable the alarm just by pressing the keychain button, why does she need to press it at all? Why doesn't it just detect that she's coming in with the keychain in her pocket? Just like Gomes models, cognitive task analyses also have some strengths and some weaknesses. One strength is that they emphasize mental processes. Unlike the Gomes model, cognitive task analysis puts an emphasis on what goes on inside the user's head. It's thus much better equipped to understand how experts think and work. The information it generates is also formal enough to be used for interface design, for comparison among alternatives, and more. There are disadvantages though. One, cognitive task analyses are incredibly time-intensive to perform. They involve talking to multiple experts for extended periods of time, then systematically analyzing the data. A second weakness is that cognitive task analyses risk de-emphasizing context. In zooming in on the individual's own thought processes, cognitive task analysis risks de-emphasizing details that are out in the world, like the role of physical capabilities or interactions amongst different people or different artifacts. And third, like Gomes models, cognitive task analysis also isn't well suited to novices. It's well suited to expert users who have very strong models of the way they work and clearly understand their own mental thought processes, but they're not very well suited for novice users who are still trying to learn how to use an interface. Gomes and cognitive task analysis are just two of many alternatives to understanding how users approach tasks. More in line with the human information processor models, there exist models like KLM, TLM, and MHP, which capture even finer grained actions for estimating performance speed. There are other extensions to Gomes as well that add things like sub-goals or other ways of expressing content like CPM Gomes and NGomes L. CPM Gomes focuses on parallel tasks, while NGomes L provides a natural language interface for interacting with Gomes models. More along the lines of cognitive models, there exist other methods as well, like CDM, TKS, CFM, applied cognitive task analyses, and skill-based cognitive task analyses. CDM puts a focus on places where critical decisions occur. TKS focuses on the nature of humans' knowledge. CFM focuses on complexity. ACTA and skill-based CTA are two ways of gathering the information necessary to create a cognitive model. There also exist other frameworks more common in other disciplines. For example, production systems are a common tool in artificial intelligence, but they're intended to model cognitive systems the same way these cognitive models do. So we could apply production systems here as well and attempt to prescribe rules for users to follow. Every possible application of HCI involves users completing some sort of task. That task might be something within a domain. In educational technology, for example, that task might be learning how to do a certain kind of problem. If your area is more technological, the task might be something the user is doing through your application, like using virtual reality and gesture recognition to sculpt a virtual statue. Take a moment and try to think of the kinds of tasks you might be interested in exploring in your chosen application area. Do they lend themselves more to an information processor model like Gomes, or to cognitive models like hierarchical task analysis? And how can you tell? Today we've talked at length about two general methods for approaching task analysis. One, the Gomes family of approaches, tries to distill tasks down to their goals, operators, methods, and selection rules. The other, cognitive task analyses, aim to get into the head of the user and understand what they're thinking, feeling, and remembering at every stage of the task. When we discuss design lifecycles, we focus a bit on how to fill these models with information, but our focus there is on the methods for gathering the information rather than the structure of the information itself. So it's important to keep these methods in mind when we talk about that. In discussing human-computer interaction, there's often a tendency to look narrowly at the user interacting with the computer, or slightly more broadly at the user interacting with the task through some computer. But many times we're actually interested in zooming even further out. We're interested not only in the interaction between the human, the computer, and the task, but also in the context in which that interaction takes place. So today we're going to look at 4 different models or theories of the context surrounding HCI. We'll focus primarily on distributed cognition, which is one of the dominant theories on the interplay between multiple agents, artifacts, and context. We'll also touch on 3 other significant theories: social cognition, situated action, and activity theory. Cognition on its own is interested in thought processes and experiences, and we naturally think of those as occurring inside the mind. But distributed cognition suggests that models of cognition should be extended outside the mind. This theory proposes expanding the unit we use to analyze intelligence from a single mind to a mind equipped with other minds and artifacts and the relationships among them. So let's take an example of this. Amanda, give me a hard addition problem.
1,238 plus 6,437.
Okay, can I do that in my head? No, I honestly can't even remember the numbers you just read to me. But I have a pen and paper here, and using those I can easily write down the numbers. So give those numbers to me again.
1,238 plus 6,437.
Okay, and using that I can now do the calculations by hand. And the answer is 7,675. Now, did I get smarter when I grabbed the pen and paper? Not really, not by the usual definition of smarter at least. But the system comprised of myself, the pen, the paper is a lot more than just my mind on its own. The cognition was distributed amongst these artifacts. Specifically, the paper took care of remembering the numbers for me and remembering and tracking my progress so far. So instead of adding 1,238 plus 6,437, I was really just adding 8 plus 7, 3 plus 3, 2 plus 4, and so on. One of the seminal works in distributed cognition research is a paper from the Journal of Cognitive Science from 1995 called How a Cockpit Remembers Its Speeds by Edwin Hutchins. You might recognize Edwin Hutchins' name from our lesson on direct manipulation and invisible interfaces. He was one of the co-authors there as well, along with Don Norman. This is one of my favorite papers, in part simply because of the very subtle change in emphasis that we see in the title. We tend to think of remembering as a uniquely human or biological behavior. We describe computers as having memory, but we don't usually describe computers as remembering things. Remembering is more of a human behavior. But the paper title twists that a little bit. It isn't the human, it isn't the pilot remembering, it's the cockpit remembering. What is the cockpit? The cockpit is a collection of controls, sensors, and interfaces, as well as the pilots themselves. The paper title tells us that it's this entire system, the pilots, the sensors, the controls, and the interfaces among them, that do the remembering. The system as a whole, the cockpit as a whole, is remembering the speed, not just the human pilot or pilots in the cockpit. No individual part in isolation remembers what the system as a whole can remember. In order to understand the application of distributed cognition to the cockpit, it's important for us to first understand what challenge it's addressing. The technical reasons for this are a bit complex, and I strongly encourage reading the full paper to get the full picture. But to understand the simplified description I'll give here, here's what you need to know. When a plane is descending for landing, there exists a number of different changes the pilots need to make to the wing configurations. These changes are made at different speeds during the descent. When the plane slows down to a certain speed, it demands a certain change to the wing configuration. The speeds at which these configuration changes must happen differ based on a number of different variables. So for every flight, there's a unique set of speeds that must be remembered. That's why the title of this paper is How a Cockpit Remembers Its Speeds. Speeds, plural. It isn't just remembering how fast it's going now, it's remembering a sequence of speeds at which multiple changes must be made. The configuration changes to the wings must be made during the descent at narrowly defined times. That creates a high cognitive load. Pilots must act quickly, and mistakes could mean the deaths of themselves and hundreds of others. So, how do they do this? First, the pilots have pages that contain the speeds for their descent based on different parameters. The cockpit itself has an entire booklet of pages like this. So we know that the cockpit has its pilots who are responsible for actually reasoning over things. But that booklet forms the cockpit's long-term memory of different speeds for different parameters. Then, prior to the descent, the pilots find the page from that booklet that corresponds to their current parameters. They pull it out and pin it up inside the cockpit. That way, the sheet is accessible to both pilots, and they're able to check one another's actions throughout. This becomes one form of the cockpit's short-term memory, a temporary representation of the current speeds. At this point, we have to attribute knowledge of those speeds to the cockpit itself. If we were to isolate either pilot, they would be unable to say what the speeds are from memory. But without the pilots to interpret those speeds, the card itself is meaningless. So it's the system of the entire cockpit, including the pilots, the booklet, and the current card, that remembers the speeds. Then as the pilots begin the descent, they mark the different speeds right on the speedometer with these little speed bugs. The speed bugs tell them which speeds to remember in a way that can just be visually compared. When they see the speedometer pass a speed bug, they know it's time to make a certain change. This is like the working memory for the cockpit. The short-term memory stores the numbers in a way that the pilots can reason over, But the speed bugs on the speedometer store them in a way that they can very quickly just visually compare. They don't need to remember the numbers themselves or do any math. All they have to do is visually compare the speed bugs to the current position of the speedometer. So what do we see from the system as a whole? Well, we see the long-term memory in the book of cards. We see a short-term memory in the card they selected. We see a working memory in the speed bugs on the speedometer. And we see decisions on when to make configuration changes distributed across the pilots and these artifacts. No single part of this cockpit, not the pilots, not the speed bugs, not the cards, could perform the actions necessary to land the plane on their own. It's only the system as a whole that does so. That's the essence of distributed cognition. The cognition involved in landing this plane is distributed across the components of the system. This is a deeper notion than just using interfaces to help us do tasks. The important thing here is that these different interfaces serve cognitive roles in the system. Distributed cognition is deeply related to the idea of cognitive load. Recall that cognitive load refers to your mind's ability to deal with only a certain amount of information at a time. Distributed cognition suggests that artifacts add additional cognitive resources. That means the same cognitive load is distributed across a greater number of resources. Artifacts are like plugging extra memory into your brain. Driving is a good example of this. Sometimes while driving, your cognitive load can be very, very high. You have to keep track of the other cars around you. You have to keep track of your own speed, to monitor your route planning. You have to make predictions about traffic patterns. You have to pay attention to your own level of gasoline, or in my case, electric charge. You might be attending to something in your car as well, like talking to your passenger or keeping an eye on your child in the back seat. It can be a big challenge. A GPS is a way of offloading one of those tasks, navigation, onto a different system, and thus your cognition is now distributed between you and the GPS. Turn on cruise control, and now it's distributed across the car as well. You're offloading the task of tracking your speed to the car. Every task you offload to artifacts decreases your own personal cognitive load. Let's analyze a simple task from the perspective of distributed cognition. Here we see Morgan paying some bills the old-fashioned way. For each bill, she pulls it off the pile, reads it, writes a check, then puts them together in the stack on the right. Where do we delineate this system? What are its parts? We're interested in any part of the system that performs some of the cognition for Morgan. While the chair, table, and light overhead make this possible, they aren't serving any cognitive roles. Morgan herself, of course, is, and the two pile of bills are too. They are an external memory of what bills Morgan has already paid and what she still needs to pay. This way she doesn't have to mentally keep track of what bills she has left to do. The bills themselves remember a lot of information for her as well, like the amounts and the destinations they need to be sent to. What about the pen and checkbook? That's where things start to get a little bit more tricky. The checkbook itself is part of the system because it takes care of the record-keeping task for Morgan. Checkbooks create carbon copies, which means Morgan doesn't have to think about tracking the checks manually. The pen is a means of communicating between these systems, which means it's part of our distributed cognition system as well. Something important to note is that distributed cognition isn't really another design principle. Distributed cognition is more of a way of looking at interface design. It's a way of approaching the problem that puts your attention squarely on how to extend the mind across artifacts. We could actually view many of our design principles as examples of distributed cognition. So this is my computer, and when I set this up, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of distributed cognition, and yet we can use distributed cognition as a lens through which to view this design. For example, I always have my calendar open on the right. That's a way of offloading having to keep track of my daily schedule and working memory. It bugs me if I have a teleconference to attend or somewhere I need to go. And in fact, I rely on this so much that it gets me in trouble. It doesn't keep track of where I need to be for a given meeting, and if I fail to keep track of that in working memory, I might end up at home when I need to be at Georgia Tech. We can even view trivial things like a clock as an example of distributed cognition that prevents me from having to keep track of the passage of time manually. The point is that distributed cognition is a way of looking at interfaces and interface design that focuses your attention on what systems as a whole can accomplish, as opposed to individuals on their own. Distributed cognition is a fun one to reflect on because we can take it to some pretty silly extremes. We could go so far as to say that I don't heat up my dinner, the system comprised of myself and the microwave heats it up, and I offload the need to track the time to cook onto my microwave's timer. And that's a perfectly valid way of looking at things. But what we're interested in is places where interfaces don't just make our lives more convenient. We're interested in places where the systems comprised of us and interfaces are capable of doing more, specifically because those interfaces exhibit certain cognitive qualities. Those systems might perceive, they might remember, they might learn, they might act on our behalf In some way, they're offloading a cognitive task from us, and as a result, the system comprised of us and the interface is capable of doing more. So reflect on that a bit. What is the place where the system comprised of you and some number of interfaces is capable of doing more than you alone, specifically because of the cognitive qualities that the interfaces possess? Almost any interface on the computer could be analyzed from the perspective of distributed cognition, but right now I'm most interested in my email. My email is an unbelievable extension of my long-term memory because whenever I see anything in email, I know I don't actually need to commit it to my own long-term memory. It's there, it's saved forever, and if I ever need to find it again, I'll be able to find it. Now, finding it might take some work sometimes, but rarely as much work as manually remembering it. For me, I also mark messages as unread if I'm the one they're waiting on or if I need to make sure I come back to them. And so my email is an external memory of both all my communications via email and tasks that are waiting on me to move forward. Distributed cognition is concerned with how the mind can be extended by relations with other artifacts and other individuals. Because we're interface designers, we probably focus most of our time on the artifacts part of that. After all, even though we're designing tasks, the artifacts are what we're actually creating that's out in the world. But the other part of distributed cognition, distributing across individuals, presents a powerful opportunity as well. This used to be far more important, actually. Before the days of GPS navigation, a different form of navigation assistance existed. It was your spouse or your friend sitting in the passenger seat, reading a map and calling out directions to you. And while mobile devices and artificial intelligence may have replaced humans in some such systems, there are still lots of places where the role of distributing across humans is crucial. Here's an example of this in action today. At Udacity, we use a tool for managing projects called Jira. It breaks down projects into multiple pieces that can be moved through a series of steps and assigned to different responsible individuals. The entire value of Jira is that it manages distributing tasks across members of a team. Thus, when a project is completed, it is completed by the system comprising the individual team members and Jira itself. The social portion of distributed cognition is concerned with how social connections create systems that can together accomplish tasks. So for example, you and your friend sitting in the passenger seat together form a system capable of navigating to a new destination without a GPS. But social cognition is not only concerned with how social relationships combine to accomplish tasks, it's also concerned with the cognitive underpinnings of social interactions themselves. It's interested in how perception, memory, and learning relate to social phenomena. As interface designers, though, why do we care? Well, in case you haven't noticed, one of the most common applications of interface design today involves social media. Everything is becoming social. Facebook tries to tell you when your friends are already nearby. Udacity tries to connect you with other students working on the same material as you. Video games are increasingly trying to convince you to share your achievements and highlights with your friends. And yet oftentimes, our interfaces are at odds with how we really think about social interaction. Designing for this well involves understanding the cognitive underpinnings of social relationships. My PlayStation, for example, has a feature for finding my real-life friends and then communicating to them my gaming habits. But really, I probably don't want them to know how much I might play video games. If I come unprepared for a recording today, I certainly don't want Amanda to know it's because I was playing Skyrim for 6 hours last night. So if we're going to design interfaces that integrate with social interactions, we have to understand how social interactions actually work. So an understanding of social cognition is very important if that's the direction you want to take. Let's tackle a challenge of designing for social relationships. I like to play video games. I'm friends with people from work. So it's natural that I might want to play games with people from work. But at the same time, my relationship with people from work isn't purely social. If they see I'm playing a game, maybe they say, hey, David's got some free time, I should ask him to help me out with something. Or if they see I spend a lot of time playing video games, maybe they more generally say, hey, David's got plenty of time to take on new tasks. How do we design a social video gaming system that nonetheless protects against these kind of perceptions? There are a lot of creative ways we might tackle this problem. One might be to base social video game relationships around something like Tinder. Tinder, if it isn't still around by the time you're watching this, is a dating app where you express interest in others and are only connected if they also expressed interest in you. We could apply the same philosophy to video games. You could set it such that my contacts can't just look up my game playing habits, but if they're also playing or interested in playing, they're alerted that I'm playing as well. In terms of social cognition, that's kind of getting at the idea of an in-group. Your behaviors are only seen by those who share them, and thus are in no position to judge them. Like distributed cognition, situated action is strongly concerned with the context within which people interact. But unlike distributed cognition, situated action is not interested in the long-term and enduring permanent interactions amongst these things. That's not to say that the theory denies the existence of long-term memory, but just has a different focus. Situated action focuses on humans as improvisers. It's interested not in the kinds of problems that people have solved before, but in the kinds of novel situational problems that arise all the time. So for an example, this is the first time I'm filming with my daughter on camera. I don't know how she'll act. I don't have contingency plans set up to react or how to react if she acts strangely or if she distracts me from my script. I'm just going to figure this out as I go along. This is the kind of interaction that situated action is interested in, and that's important for us as interface designers. While we like to think we're in charge of structuring the task for our users, in reality the tasks that we perform are growing out of this interaction. We can try our best to guide it in certain directions, but until we actually get our hands on it, the task doesn't exist. The task of me filming with my daughter didn't exist until this moment. Once we've got our hands on it, the task is what we do, not what we design. So as users, when we use an interface, when we actually do something, we're defining the task as we go along. So there are 3 key takeaways here. 1, we must examine the interfaces we design within the context in which they're used. 2, we must understand that the task that the users perform grows out of this interaction with our interfaces. We don't define it. And 3, we can try to structure it as much as we can, but until users get started, the task itself doesn't exist. And once they get started, they play a significant role in defining the task. Situated action gives us a valuable lens to examine issues of memory. We mentioned in our lessons on memory and on design principles that recognition is easier than recall. People have an easier time recognizing the right answer or option when they see it rather than recalling it from scratch. That's in part because memory is so context dependent. Recognition provides the necessary context to identify the right option. Relying on recall means there's little context to cue the right answer to the user's memory. Now, I encountered an interesting example of the value of situated action a little while ago. My mother just had surgery, and so I would often go over to help her out with things. And every time I'd go over, she'd have 4 or 5 favors to ask me. Inevitably, I would forget a couple of those favors and have to be reminded, but she would always remember. Why was she so much better able to remember the favors than me? Does she just have a better memory? She didn't make a list, she didn't write them down or anything like that. So the distributed cognition perspective doesn't find an external memory being used or anything like that. My hypothesis from the perspective of situated action is that she has the context behind the tasks. She knows why they need to be done. She knows what will happen if they aren't. For her, they're part of a broader narrative. For me, they're items on a list. I have no context for why they're there or what happens if they're undone. For her, they're easy to remember because they're situated in a larger context. For me, they're difficult because they're isolated. Lucy Suchman's 1985 book, Plans and Situated Actions, is the seminal book on the philosophy of situated action. The book is a detailed comparison between 2 views of human action. The first view, she writes, views the organization and significance of action as derived from plans. And this is the model we very often adopt when developing interfaces. Users make plans, and users carry out those plans. But Suchman introduces a second view as well. In this view, people simply act in the world, and plans are what we derive from those actions. Instead of plans dictating actions, plans are interpretations of actions. What this means for us as interface designers is that rather than assuming the user has a plan in mind that they're actively carrying out, we might consider viewing only their immediate interaction with the current screen instead. In other words, forget the history of actions that led the user to a certain screen and ask just, once they're here, how do they know what to do next? Later in the book, Lucy Suchman specifically touches on communication between humans and machines. There's a lot more depth here as well. The key takeaway for us is to focus on the resources available to the user at any given time, but I do recommend reading the book and this chapter for more insights. Activity theory is a massive and well-developed set of theories regarding the interaction between various pieces of an activity. The theory as a whole is so complex that you could teach an entire class on it alone. It predates HCI, and in fact, activity theory is one of the first places the idea of interacting through an interface actually came from. In our conversations about HCI, though, there are 3 main contributions of activity theory that I'd like you to come away with. First, when we discuss designing tasks and completing tasks through an interface, we risk missing a key component. Why? We could jump straight to designing the task, but why is the user completing the task in the first place? That can have significant implications for our design. Activity theory generalizes our unit of analysis from the task to the activity. We're not just interested in what they're doing, but why they're doing it and what it means to them. Our designs will be different, for example, if users are using a system because they're required to, or because they choose to. Notice how this is similar to our discussion of distributed cognition as well. In distributed cognition, we were generalizing the unit of analysis from a person to a system of people and artifacts. Here, we're generalizing the unit of analysis from a task to an activity surrounding a task. In both ways, we're zooming out on the task and the design space. Second, activity theory puts an emphasis on the idea that we can create low-level operations from higher-level actions. We saw something similar to this with Gomes models, where methods were made up of operators. This has a special historical significance. Before activity theory and similar theories reached HCI in the 1980s, HCI was largely concerned with minute things like how quickly a person can click a button or type in a command. Activity theory helped us zoom out from those low-level interactions, those low-level operators, to general user needs at the action or the activity levels. And third, activity theory points out that actions by the user can actually move up and down this hierarchy. A common example of this is driving a car. The first time you drove a car, shifting gears between park and drive was a very conscious action made up of operators like grabbing the gear shift, moving it in the right direction, and letting go. You had to think about how to press the button, which way to push the stick, and when to release it. However, after driving a few times, shifting gears just becomes second nature. It becomes more like an operator. It shifted from being a conscious goal to an operator in your broader driving behavior. Notice the similarity here to our previous discussion on learning curves. How quickly an action moves from being a conscious action to a subconscious operator is also a function of how good the learning curve is on that design. Notice also this is similar to the question of invisible interfaces. A good invisible interface helps users focus on their actions inside the task rather than the operators they use to interact with the system. In 1996, Bonnie Nardi edited a prominent book on the study of context in human-computer interaction titled Context and Consciousness. The entire book is worth reading, but two papers in particular stand out to me, both by Nardi herself. The first is a short paper that serves in some ways as an introduction to the book as a whole. It's not a long paper, only 4 pages, so I highly recommend reading it. It won't take you long. Here, Nardi outlines the general application of activity theory to HCI. She notes that activity theory offers a set of perspectives on human activity and a set of concepts for describing that activity. And this is exactly what HCI research needs as we struggle to understand and describe context, situation, and practice. She particularly notes that the theory is uniquely suited to addressing some of the interesting issues facing HCI in 1996. And for that reason, it's also fascinating to view from a historical perspective. Today, we understand the role that context has grown to play, especially with emerging technologies. It's fascinating to me to look back at how the community was constructing that debate 20 years ago. In this lesson, we've covered 3 theories on studying context in human-computer interaction: distributed cognition, situated action, and activity theory. If you're having trouble keeping the 3 straight, though, Nardi has a great paper for you. From her volume Context and Consciousness, Nardi wrote a comparison between the 3 philosophies she titled Studying Context, a Comparison of Activity Theory, Situated Action Models, and Distributed Cognition. She starts by giving a great 1-page summary of each of these 3 views, which would be really good if you're having trouble understanding the finer points of these theories. Even more usefully, she goes on to give commentary on the difference between these 3 big theories. First, she notes that activity theory and distributed cognition are driven by goals, whereas situated action de-emphasizes goals for a focus on improvisation. She goes on to summarize that situated action says goals are constructed retroactively to interpret our past actions. Nardi also evaluates the role of permanent persistent structures, noting they are important for activity theory and distributed cognition, but present a tension for situated action. So here we again see a similarity between activity theory and distributed cognition. So what makes them different? Well, Nardi writes that the main difference between activity theory and distributed cognition is their evaluation of the symmetry between people and artifacts. Activity theory regards them as fundamentally different, given that humans have consciousness. Distributed cognition, by contrast, believes that artifacts can serve cognitive roles, and so those should be considered conceptually equivalent to humans. So that gives a high-level overview of the difference between these three theories. These theories are big and complex, of course, and the complete paper goes into much more detail, but this should provide a decent glimpse at the distinctions, at least enough to get you started reading the paper for yourself. Distributed cognition is a perspective on analyzing systems that helps us emphasize the cognitive components of interfaces themselves. It helps us look at things we design as extensions of the user's own cognition. We can view anything from notes on a desktop to the entire internet as an extension of the user's own memory. We can view things like Gmail's automatic email filtering as offloading cognitive tasks from the user. In looking at things through this lens, we focus on the output not just of people into interfaces, but on the combination of people and interfaces together. So what are they able to do together that neither of them could do individually? As we close this lesson, think about this in terms of your chosen areas of HCI. What are the cognitive components of the areas with which you're dealing? How do augmented reality and wearable devices offload some of the user's cognition onto the interface? In educational technology or in HCI for healthcare, what are the tasks being accomplished by the systems comprised of users and interfaces? In this lesson, we've talked about distributed cognition and a couple related theories. The commonality of all these theories was their emphasis on context and integrated systems. Distributed cognition is interested in how cognition can be distributed among multiple individuals and artifacts all working together. By taking a distributed view of interface design, we can think about what the combination of our users and our interfaces are able to accomplish. Situated action and activity theory give additional perspectives on this, focusing respectively on the importance of ad hoc improvisation and the need to emphasize users' motives beyond just their goals. The common ground for all these theories is that our interfaces are not simply between the user and their task, but they also exist in some kind of greater context.